All righty. Good morning, everybody. Hope everybody's having a wonderful start to their hump day. And we're going to start off today with a wonderful guest that has quite a lot of experience and expertise to talk about in various different fields here today. So I have a feeling we're going to have a very lively comment section and question section. And those of y'all that are going to be watching this after the fact that don't catch it live, by all means, please leave some questions in the comments because we're more than likely thinking about a part two because we've got a lot of stuff to cover. But our guest today is, I believe he retired as, and he'll correct me here, I believe he retired as a staff sergeant, Mr. John Doc Spears. He was with 3rd Battalion, 7th Group. He was an 18 Delta medic. And if I'm not mistaken as well, he is one of the initial members, or maybe even a plank holder of the Army Sniper School, and had experience in South America, quite a lot of experience, shall I say. Panama, El Salvador, Colombia, Peru, Bolivia. He was running anti-narcotic missions with the DEA down there. So yet again, another interesting aspect we've not heard about on here. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Mr. John, let him introduce himself, and we'll get this ball rolling. Mr. John, floor is yours, sir.
Hey, bud. Yeah, John Spears, and I'm sure proud and glad that you reached out to me. My particular area of experience was a period of the 1980s where we were at the height of finishing the Cold War in this country and our fight against worldwide communist domination. And my piece of the pie was in counterinsurgency and counter-narco-terrorism in the Central and South American theaters with 7th Group in the 1980s. So those are the things that I was a part of as a foot soldier of our foreign policy, particularly in the Civil War in El Salvador. And was a proud participant for my small part, and of anything in the world that I can leave the for posterity, that I'm proud of. It's not the my education or the letters before or after my name or the fact that I'm a proud husband and a dad, but if people were to remember anything about me, I always say that if I'm remembered for being a proud plank holder of the U.S. Army Sniper School and the sniper community and my contributions there, I'm most proud of being a member of Special Forces who helped to turn back the communist invasion attempted in the Western Hemisphere.
It's my volume went down. You've got quite an amazing story, not even involving the military, because I'd forgotten your other credentials. If I'm not mistaken, you were actually, I believe, a spine surgeon or a back surgeon or a spine surgeon.
Those are one and the same.
One and the same. Okay. You and as well, which we'll get into, but I just wanted to let people know he's also did a bit of contracting work, defense contracting. So Mr. John is a jack of all trades, shall we say.
I'm very blessed. I'm very fortunate. I've had and continue to have a very full life, and despite my best efforts, really continually surprising, fun, and great things happen where I get to make a contribution to the defense industry in our national security. So I'm very pleased. I'm very proud of what I've been able to do, and glad I still get to do those things.
That's amazing. And I imagine, I think you said offline, you're actually going to be here getting pretty busy, going to, I think you said Bragg for the annual sniper competition coming up.
Yeah, Benning Infantry Week starts next week. So the International Sniper Comp is going on. I've got 4 teams associated with the Warrior Training Center at Benning who will be competing this year. And I've been a contractor to them for several years, helping do train up and coaching for the teams that they send to the ISC and other competitions around the country, representing U.S. Army snipers, and we've done great. I mean, every year that I've been involved, we've had teams either win ISC or come in second place, or we have more teams usually in the top 5 and in top 10 than any other unit. So I'm really proud and pleased to have had a small hand in those guys' success. You know, their success is my success, though that I can take no credit for their success because they're just fantastic individuals. You know, the snipers that the Army is training and fielding now are truly the finest snipers who've ever lived. They're fantastic folks.
And we'll get into sniping a bit more, but before we jump into the beginning of your service, does this particular competition, is it just Army wide, or is it special forces groups from other branches? Or
the International Sniper Comp is hosted by the U.S. Army Sniper School at Benning, and it invites participants from all of the armed forces and international partners.
Wow. I bet you see the cream of the crop out there shooting.
Yeah, there's some absolutely great folks from all over the world. And, you know, it's like I say, it's just a great community to be a part of.
That is just too cool. And we'll definitely get back into some snipers, because I had some people that, as a matter of fact, weren't going to be able to watch live that wanted me to ask a few questions once we get down the road a bit. But
Yeah.
I had watched well, I've watched 3, but I watched one about 15 minutes ago. You were on a Library of Congress interview, and I'm going to link all of his interviews into the show notes so y'all can check out more.
I'm completely unaware of that.
it's a great, I think it was 2 young ladies that were interviewing, and they did a great job. It was about 45 minutes.
You think I should have remembered that, with those being the particulars of the atmosphere, but you know, when you get old, your memory fails you.
I was about to say,
that's my excuse for not remembering.
When you're so busy, it's hard to keep up with everything you're doing. But they did a good job kind of asking, because we always like to ask, especially the men that end up, or shall we say, seek out the special operations groups. Much of our men have been in Force Recon or SOG, and it seems like a lot of those gentlemen had fathers that were in WW2, Korea, and had a strong, not all, but a strong military background for probably 70% of them. Did you have prior service in your family?
Yeah, I come from a long tradition of military service. You know, my grandfathers, you know, on both sides of the family, who served from the 1930s through World War II. I have a grandfather on my mother's side who started in the U.S. Army Air Corps in 1930s and coastal artillery in Panama, of all places, who transitioned from the Army Air Corps to the Air Force, who I want to say he ended up doing 41 years of active service. He actually had to get a congressional exemption to stay on active duty before he retired out of Eglin Air Force Base. My own father started out in airborne artillery in the late 50s, was a jump master, is an E4, is a specialist. He was a jump master for his unit. Some of the few pictures I have of him he's been deceased many years now, but I have pictures of it from that time. And he actually got assigned to White Star in Laos.
Wow.
As a forward observer augmenting SF. And so he was a broadcast journalist after his military service for NBC on radio and TV in Detroit. And I grew up around, you know, people who you wouldn't know, you're too young, but, you know, broadcasters like John Cameron Swayze and Eric Severide and guys like that who came through the house. Army historian General SLA Marshall.
Oh gosh, yes.
Who was a columnist for the Detroit News back in those days, was a close personal friend of my dad. Bill Malden, who did all the Willie and Joe cartoons, was a guest at our house growing up in Detroit in the 60s. So I grew up around cops and soldiers, and especially people from the SF background and the Airborne background. So, my dad always joked in a not really joking way that, let me have a son who ends up being a leg,
Yeah.
so, which was never going to be an option for me. From the time I was a kid, in the 60s, all I wanted to do was grow up and jump out of airplanes. So it was definitely going to happen eventually.
And guys, for those of y'all that don't know, and of course the book's in the other room because I'm getting ready to read it, but as Jason Holmes put here, Project White Star was the beginning of the secret war, shall we say. The 18 guys were already going over there, but White Star was American advisors. Several of the guys, like Walt Shoemate and a few others, would end up in SOG, and that was the first group set up training indigenous fighters in Laos before the agreement was neutral to make it neutral. So that's a very distinct unit for your father to find his way into to serve with.
Yeah, he wasn't SF, but he had ended up getting assigned over there because they needed extra help. And he was a forward observer and obviously airborne qualified and a jump master. And of course, he was extremely proud of his service in White Star. He died in 1976, and I joined the Army at 17 in 1981. And eventually, by the time I'd made myself to Bragg and the Special Warfare Center, and I had... It's a weird story, but initially in the Army, I was my MOS. I was a defense information specialist, which kind of a weird job. It's not what I wanted to do, but it's what I ended up at. And and after I got an airborne slot, I ended up being assigned to the command group of U.S. Army SOCOM. The first year it was stood up in 1984 at Bragg. Which is to say, is like a young enlisted guy. Being in the command group, I'm surrounded by nothing but, full colonels, light colonels, command sergeant majors, civilian advisors, of people from the special operations community. And it was quite a thing to run into some guys and tell them my story, who'd been in White Star, who'd remembered my dad.
Wow.
From all those years before, it was something else.
That's amazing. That's a heck of a history right there, and especially being surrounded by all those amazing names that you mentioned. It's you can see why you found yourself in special forces.
It had been my goal from the time I was a kid, growing up the way I did, and wanting to be like the people I admired most and wanting to be where the action was. And, in my day, it's not like now, the 18 X-ray program, if you know what that is, that started up during the GWAT to bring highly qualified people into the Army to give them pretty much a straight path into special forces. And over the years, I've met a lot of those 18 X-rays, and they are very special people. In my day, traditionally, your only route into special forces was by doing a hitch in the regular Army first, before you could even apply to go to special forces. So, you had to be patient. And, during my period of time, and for everybody's pretty much pre-GWAT, guys had 3, 4, 6, 8 years in the regular Army before, they got selected to get the opportunity to go to special forces. So, try and do my best to, keep it G-rated for everybody. But, we all we all called it, you had to eat the green weenie from the big army for, for a hitch, before you got to special forces. And, I don't know, every generation is a reflection of what's going on and the people are around it. But, one of the reasons why special forces has always had kind of a reputation for being hard to get along with is because they're full of people who, ate shit in the regular army, being mistreated in many, many cases, and couldn't wait to get to somewhere where they were able to utilize their intelligence and their initiative and be somewhere where that was rewarded. And then, thereafter, you definitely eschew having to be around like regular army people, or people think that they have dominion over you by necessity of rank. And guys didn't flaunt it necessarily, but it was very common to be in situations where, you didn't take pleasure in it, but you would have to tell, officers and other higher ranking NCOs, I don't work for you. I'm in this country doing a separate mission. You don't like it, go pound sand, complain to my command if you can. They're going to back me and not you. So,
Yeah. I mean, that kind of sounds like it was in like 68 and 69 in Vietnam. They, with the 18 X-ray program, they kind of had it like with John Stryker Meyer and that group, to where they were letting guys fresh in the Army, asking them right after jump school, do you want to maybe see if you can get into special forces? And boom, straight from, jump school and all of that into special forces. Like you said, what the Army needs at that time is going to happen.
That's a fact. During my period of time, I want to say my route from the beginning of the Q course is a 18 Delta as a medic until I was done. And then you do a period of OJT in a hospital afterwards. I want to say it was about like 14 months. Now I believe, it's varied. It's built up to like an 18 Delta can be in the Q course for about 2 years.
Yeah.
There were times in during the height of the Vietnam War where, the period of time it took to train the most technical skill in SF Special Forces medic was, probably 5 or 6 months in the Q course. And for weapons men going what it was in those days, I had instructors in phase 1 in the Q course who were Vietnam era guys, who were like, oh yeah, when I went through the Q course, it was 12 weeks, phase 1 MOS phase, and Robin Sage, and, and you were in Vietnam, 2 weeks after that. So.
Wow. It's amazing. The transformation, and that's why we're glad getting to speak to someone like you, that we're getting to hear the different aspect of the process here. But I don't think I found out in some of the prior interviews. I think you mentioned you were born in Pensacola. Where did you end up at basic training at?
Where did I do basic at? I entered service from Detroit, Michigan, and I ended up at Fort Jackson, South Carolina.
Oh, Lord.
I had actually at 17, I had enlisted to be a parachute rigger, because that was, that's kind of, I want to be airborne. I want to be infantry. I want to go over here and go like, we get you a job as a parachute rigger. We get you assigned to like one of the special forces groups. Maybe that's your way into special forces. I said, that sounds great. And, I think about 3/4 of the way through basic training at Fort Jackson, Spears, report to the company CP. It's like, what'd I do? And the first sergeant was a very kindly guy, and he said, Spears, we got to send you to personnel. You've been reclassed. Parachute rigger is overstrength, and they have to find you another MOS. And I said, well, that's awful. And I was pretty dejected and pretty down. And I don't even remember, they gave you an opportunity to choose a bunch of different MOSs. And I was pretty down, and graduated basic training, was actually in a holdover company, waiting for orders with a bunch of dudes who had been recycled through basic training, and was pretty down, and got orders to be a defense information specialist, which part of that is a track that goes to public affairs. Part of it's a track that leads to psychological operations. And I ended up at Fort Ben Harrison, Indiana, going through DINFOS, the Defense Information School, learning how to be a photojournalist, essentially, and was pretty dejected, but, it was kind of like going to college, really. It was pretty unusual. And then ended up my first couple of years as a leg in the 7th Infantry Division out in Fort Ord, California on Monterey Bay, which was quite an experience for a young hillbilly kid like me who, grown up between the Gulf Coast of Florida and in Michigan. I was pretty unprepared for the California lifestyle, but then ended up spending, a great deal of the rest of my life out there. And during that period of time in the early 80s, a lot of very interesting things were happening. I've always been, growing up in a household with a national broadcast journalist. Was always very interested in current affairs and grew up perpetually aware of what was happening in the world at the time in the news, and especially the Civil War in El Salvador featured very prominently in my interest from the time I was in high school in the 70s. And it always in my mind thought that I wanted to work to get into special forces, and I wanted to find my way to be in El Salvador. That was what was going on. That's where the only shooting war per se was going on that we were involved in. And, by hook or by crook or intention or, God's grace, that is what I ended up being able to do.
Wow. It's amazing you seeing it on high school, on the news, and little did you know there you'd actually end up like you were sounding like you were wanting to quite heavily. When you mentioned being with the 7th Infantry Division at Fort Ord, is this where you kind of leave being a leg, shall we say, and go to SF? Is that your next school?
That was the next step, was just, first, getting to jump school. So you had to be, the way the rules were in that day, you had to be stabilized at your first permanent change of station for 2 years before you could put in a personnel action to go to Airborne and get to Bragg. And that was kind of like a stepping stone to getting to SF and getting a slot for the Q course. But, some interesting, God puts you where you're supposed to be. And some, pretty interesting things happened to me where I got to be a witness to history or a participant in history. Very early on in that period of time, I got to deploy to South Korea with the 7th Infantry Division. Wow. For 2 months on what was called Team Spirit, was an exercise, and got to spend a very considerable amount of time on the DMZ. Having photographic skills, the Military Intelligence Battalion utilized me to record a visit to the DMZ, where we visited every ground radar site from the Yellow Sea to the Sea of Japan, and got to document and visit and get a tour across the DMZ to see the propaganda war going from north to south, to get to talk to participants in that. This was just a handful of years after the Korean tree cutting incident.
We just had a Project Sigma SOG vet who was actually there that day, and we have photos to where he was taking pictures right as the event is taking place. Sorry to interrupt.
No, not at all. It's a very important piece of history, and as I'll talk about as we eventually, transition into talking about in El Salvador, it's one of those incidents that was part of the zeitgeist, if you will, the national atmosphere that led to some of the strictures that we had to suffer in El Salvador, fighting the Civil War there. But I got to see the side of the tree and Korean tree cutting incident, got to see Propaganda Village and Panmunjom. And just like I say, to get to be a witness to history, it was a very, very special thing for me to do is just being in South Korea at a time where the tensions were still so high, where, landing at Osan Air Base, where U-2 flights were taking off, on a daily basis. And, the propaganda war across the DMZ was going full scale with, huge, like towering banks of speakers on the north side, broadcasting propaganda to the south, to the villages, saying you have 30 days to defect before the People's Democratic Republic of Korean Army, storms across the DMZ to liberate the South, and we won't be discriminate. We'll kill everyone in our path. So defect across the DMZ now. And, and we have banks of propaganda speakers, broadcasting things across, there were, army defectors, crazy people who did make their way across the DMZ, who were captured as prisoners of the North and used for propaganda purposes. There were villagers, South Koreans who succumbed to the propaganda, who, the patrols would pick up on the DMZ and bring them back across all the time. It was really something to see. And then in late 83, early 84 is when the U.S. military buildup in Honduras began, which was part of the anti-Nicaraguan Sandinista Liberation Front movement, where our support of the, quote, rebel freedom fighters, the Contras, happened. And I got selected individually and deployed to Honduras during that period of time for the U.S. buildup. And again, not acting as a defense information specialist and as a competent photographer, I got assigned to a detached engineer brigade in southern Honduras, where I was primarily doing photo reconnaissance with reconnaissance teams from the engineer brigade, where they were building clandestine airfields all across Honduras, particularly across the border with Nicaragua, and doing cross-border operations to build anti-tank avenues, tank traps to prevent a high-speed avenue of approach from Nicaragua into Honduras, and spent 6 months doing that with frequent trips to El Salvador, across the Gulf of Fonseca to support operations going on in El Salvador, the engineer operations and other things. So, as a young troop who just was able to, who had a technical skill, who was able to show that he had some situational awareness, and with a big background in small arms, just by showing that I was competent, was selected to do some pretty unique and interesting things. And like I say, got to be while I wasn't in special forces yet and I hadn't reached my goal, I got to be a witness to history and a participant in some pretty critical things that were happening in our hemisphere during the early 1980s. So by the time I got into special forces and was on an A team, I had actually already had some good real world experience working with mill groups and other government agencies and doing the kind of basic operations and intelligence things that you're responsible for doing in special forces. So like I say, at the time, it was a curse to me not getting to be in an airborne unit, but the couple of years I spent as a leg, some very unique opportunities opened up for me. And and it was, I learned to accept that God put you where you're supposed to be and make the most of it. And there are some lessons to learn along the way. And if you're really lucky, sometimes really good things happen.
That's that's a heck of a way to get introduced to special forces. So when did you officially pass and get to don the scroll and the green beret.
Yeah, the arrowhead and get my special forces tab. I think I started like I say, I had got through jump school easily, ended up at Bragg, and ended up getting assigned to the command group of the U.S. Army SOCOM the first year it was stood up. And from there, like I say, just from people getting to know me and, and learn who I was, from right there, SF reenlistment, the guy who ran SF reenlistment was in headquarters and took a liking to me and hand carried my paperwork to the Department of the Army. And at that time, with only 3 years in service and at the age I was, they're always short of 18 Deltas. And I wanted to be in an 18 Delta anyway, because, most people would admit it's the toughest way into special forces, but it was also, for me, is like the only way into SF as an E4, with being my age. I think I wasn't yet 20, and didn't have whatever it took at the time, 4 or 5 years in service, with just 3 years in the service. So lucked my way into the Q course then, but a lot of great things happened during that period of time, and I met a lot of just utterly stellar people. The Special Warfare Center historian was this lovely lady named Bev Lindsay that I got to know, and she'd been married to a Special Forces officer, and she was just a legend in the SF community. Long story short, she took a liking to me, and anytime somebody interesting came through her office to visit, she'd pick up the phone and give me a call and say, "John, I want you to come on over and meet somebody." So that's when I first got to meet Nick Rowe, Colonel Nick Rowe, when he was a major and had just come back to active duty. A very famous guy who stood up the Sears School, who became the commander of the Special Warfare Center Training Battalion, who tragically got assassinated in the Philippines in, I want to say, 88 or 89. Was just terrible, but she introduced me to then Major Nick Rowe, and he had a copy of his book 5 Years to Freedom, which he autographed for me. Another, "John, come over to my office, there's somebody I'd like you to meet." Went in and met Dick Meadows, who had been the assault team leader at Sante. And I later on in years, when he had a farm in Peru. Whenever I was in Peru and I would find my way up to visit with Dick Meadows, and, just an SF legend. But there was something like that where every week, we still had, do you know what the Lodge Act was? Probably a little bit for people. In the 1950s, the Lodge Act was an act passed by Congress that allowed foreign nationals to join the United States military as a route for citizenship. And in special forces in the 1950s, it was highly recruited and populated with European and Eastern Bloc refugees, guys who spoke 6, 7, European languages, who found their way into special forces through the Lodge Act. And the halls of the Special Warfare Center in SOCOM at that time were loaded with all these great guys like Sid Shacknow, who was a colonel at the time, just all these other legendary people, guys like Jake Jakovenko, who, I got to know well in later years. And a few years ago, when the documentary was being made, 27 Minutes at Sante, I was a technical advisor on the film, and I linked up spent a good week with Jake Jakovenko and Tyrone Adderley and John Gargis, who wrote the definitive book about the Sante raid. And as I was helping to film and record the movie for the production crew, and got to hang out with those guys, and talking to Jake, it's such a famous guy. If you don't know Jake Jakovenko, who was on the Sante raid, but legendary in many, many ways.
Carried the M60. He was so big.
Yeah,
He carried
Hose
the
Man.
M60.
Hose Man. I have one of his coins from Sante that he gifted me. But, you know, Jake was a refugee from Ukraine. Who, you know, his family had to escape the Bolsheviks and their slaughter in Ukraine.
The Holodomor.
His family ended up in a camp for displaced persons in Germany, and, you know, narrowly escaped being repatriated by the Russians to the Eastern Bloc before he made it to America. But, you know, just a great, so in those days, it's like I say, SWIC and SOCOM, the halls were just loaded with dudes like that. And every day I was just in awe to be there and be surrounded by those guys, and was just motivated. It's like, I will do whatever it takes to get to the Q course and get my chance to get onto an A team. And, you know, and I'm just, like I say, God smiled upon me and things came together, and that's what happened. And by the summer of 1986, I deployed to 3-7 Panama to join A team in B company. And my adventure as a special forces operator started right then and there.
Wow. Right before we enter, but this could be lining up. I'm not sure how late or how early you were around him, but speaking of legends, weren't you around, or wasn't the sergeant major for 3rd Battalion at one point in time, Mr. Kenny McMullen from SOG?
We had several SOG guys and Sante guys and Dead A guys, you know, which I know at my period of time there, the command sergeant major was Ali Olivero, who was a SOG guy who had run hatchet teams. Ali is a fantastic human being and a special forces legend, and another guy who was just so generous with his time and knowledge. You know, I mean, he had to run an entire SF battalion with the, you know, with a battalion that during that period of time, 3-7 out of Panama, was all over the planet, you know, doing things. But our A company sergeant major was Kenny McMullen, who had been a Sante Raider, and my team sergeant at the time, a guy named Tom Sneed, who was another Vietnam era vet, and Kenny Mack were best buddies. And there's Kenny back in the day. Kenny was on the assault team with Dick Meadows at Sante, and Kenny was I think I gave you a photo of me and Kenny and Tom Sneed, you know, during my last days in Panama. But Kenny was a real friend, a big brother, an inspiration to me, like he was so many guys. Just such a generous, wise guy. And you know, every day to be on teams and be around with guys like that, and to be treated like you mattered and that you were their peer. Every one of those moments was absolutely special, and, you know, and is what carried me through tough times the rest of my life. That people that I looked up to like that, you know, treated me and my generation like we were deserving and just as good as they were. So something else, you know, John Gargis, like I say, who wrote the definitive history of the Sante raid, was combat air crew for the Sante raid. John was John had escaped Slovakia behind the Iron Curtain. And John was likely, had the mission failed, had he been shot down and captured by the communists, he would have been used as a propaganda tool by the communists. Any family that he had living in the Eastern Bloc would have been murdered. John carried underneath his flight suit, wrapped himself in the American flag, so that if he was shot down and captured as a POW in North Vietnam, the last thing that he would have next to his body would be the American flag. What a great American he is. And like I say, he wrote the definitive history of Sante, and it should be read by everybody. But John later took that American flag and had it signed by all of the Sante Raiders and by all of the POWs who were supposed to have been in the Sante camp that would have been liberated by the operation by Ivory Coast. And when we were together filming the movie for the documentary of Sante, John helped me find Kenny McMullen's signature on the flag, which I took pictures of, which is a very special moment because, like for a lot of us in Special Forces, Kenny McMullen was a very, very inspirational mentor in my life and friend, and motivated me to go on and do other things in my life, like become a doctor. And a lot of that was very much due to Kenny's mentorship and his proctoring for me to get out there and give it a shot.
Wow. I can't imagine what it was like being surrounded by men of such epic stature, and also men willing to take time to teach you and not be big dogging y'all, shall we say. It's I can't imagine what it was like. And I was curious, could you let me know which, because I'm looking for the photos, do you know which photo is the one of you and Mr. Kenny on the last days? Is it
I don't know if it made it through. I sent Bud several photos of what few exist from those days. We didn't take a lot of photos back in those days for multiple reasons. Most of the time being where we were, wasn't supposed to be photographically recorded. But there's a picture in there someday of a guy like me. Oh, there's a team mission where it's not that one. That's a bunch of us, a team mission where we were going to work with the Colombia National Police anti-narco terror mission in Colombia. But it's actually the build up to Just Cause and the hostilities with the Panamanian Defense Forces were going on. So that's actually us with all of our equipment loaded up on deuce and a half trucks on landing craft, where we took it from Fort Davis on Gatun Lake, which is part of the Panama Canal, to avoid having to be interdicted and harassed by the Panamanian Defense Force, to go over to Howard Air Force Base to fly out to Colombia. So we just had to load up all our gear, demo, ammo, weapons, all of our sustainment gear, and float it through the Panama Canal to make it to Howard Air Force Base so we could load out for missions like that mission to Colombia. So a funny picture. Somewhere in there, if we find it, there's a picture of, like a scrawny me dressed like I'm out of the International Mail Catalog, which is the only place we could get clothes by a PO drop box back in overseas in the 1980s. And me and Tom Sneed and Kenny McMullen, but we can hit it up some other time. But
dang, I wish
kind of jumping around there to I know you kind of, I can go on for a piece, but I know you really wanted to talk about the El Salvador mission and what it meant to be one of the 55. Yeah, there's a picture. Like I say, forgive the fashion of the time. It's like I say, things are a lot different back in those days, especially when you were overseas. And you could find civilian clothes, at the PX, of which there was one. A small one, or we would mail order clothes from Banana Republic or International Mail. So acid wash jeans and stuff like that. But that was on my last week in Panama, my going away party at the Decade Club. That's Tom Sneed on the left, Vietnam veteran, a guy who, I'll throw things out there without going into too much detail, who would run the regional survey team for 7th Group and in Panama, and Kenny McMullen on the right. Like I say, guys who were just legends, who, who the debt of gratitude I owed them for all the things that they taught me and how they took care of me. I could, I try and repay it to the current generations, and I've always tried to pay it forward, but I can never do as much for future generations as what those guys did for me.
Gosh, that I was hoping I could find that photo, and I thought this was the one with the clothing.
Funny
that
picture.
is,
Yeah, one of the only pictures I had. But to answer questions of what was going on in the Western Hemisphere at that time, and how it describes how the 3rd Battalion of the 7th Special Forces Group was organized and the kind of people in it. It's kind of a deep dive. You reached out to me about this, from the ideas like, hey, you're such an awesome historian following the history and getting more and more stories about force recon and about special forces SOG in Vietnam. And I know you had reached out to me because you had heard that, 3-7 Panama and the really early missions in El Salvador, that, it was populated with a lot of SOG guys, and that's absolutely true. The A teams, especially Alpha and Bravo Company of 3 of 7, those 12 A teams that split between us, the El Salvador mission was very heavily populated with Vietnam era SF guys who had a lot of SOG experience, guys who had been in Special Forces Dead A Berlin, which Dead A, only recently declassified just a handful of years ago. Guys who'd been on a lot of the special projects, the special reconnaissance projects in Vietnam, guys with a lot of the CIDG, the Civilian Irregular Defense Group experience in Vietnam. So, the E7s, E8s, E9s, captains, majors, people like that. There were a lot of people who had those backgrounds of real world, the best experience that Special Forces had to offer. So, as a young SF operator, to be able to learn, urban ops and counter detection routes from guys who had been, in Dead A Berlin, learning how to do dead drops from those guys, learning how to do caches, learning how to do all of that O&I and tradecraft kind of stuff, being in the jungle and learning from guys who'd been on B-52 and had been in CCN, CCC, CCS, Sigma and B-52 Delta and stuff like that, and putting all of those tricks and tools to work in the jungle all over Central and South America. It was just invaluable. It was a learning environment like, you just couldn't believe. I learned something every day from some of the smartest, best, most experienced people in Special Forces. Not to say that I developed skills that were, anything but a fraction of what they were capable of. But you learn by doing, and especially, as I'll talk about in the El Salvador missions, all of us, the few of us who were so privileged to participate there, all of a sudden got thrown into the deep end, more or less by yourself, in a country that's in the midst of a civil war in which you're trying to help them carry out a counterinsurgency. Because 3-7 Panama at that time, because Panama had the El Salvador mission, because Central America was falling under the shadow of Marxist revolutions, 3-7 was populated purposefully by Special Forces with people who had that experience, and voluntarily by guys like myself who fought to get to where the bullets were flying. An interesting picture to just, give you some idea of the geopolitics. That's a place that we all spent a lot of time, the Gulf of Fonseca, which is a small body of water bound on three sides by El Salvador to the north, by Honduras to the northeast, and then Nicaragua to the south. And Nicaragua fell in 1979 to the Sandinista Liberation Front, a Marxist popular uprising. And we can talk about what that actually means. But as part of the worldwide communist terror complex, during those years, Honduras was on the way to falling. El Salvador was embroiled in a civil war with the right-wing militaristic government and the popular Marxist uprising of the FMLN, the Farabundo Martí Liberation Nacional, and I'll just call all of the Salvadoran guerrillas the FMLN for ease of communication. But lines of support from Nicaragua, from Cuba, from Vietnam, from the Soviet Union were flowing through Nicaragua, across Honduras, and across the Gulf of Fonseca into El Salvador to support the Marxist revolution going on in El Salvador. And that was the situation in the late 70s and the early 80s where we were working to stop all of that. So why we were in El Salvador and why we were in Central America as a whole, and one of the questions you had for me was talking about what it meant to be one of the 55. And I guess that bears some explanation, but it's not a short one, but it's very important for anybody to understand the history of what Special Forces accomplished in El Salvador and why it's so noteworthy. When we talk about the 55, what we're talking about is the mission in El Salvador to fight the counterinsurgency and assist in ending the civil war in El Salvador. We were bound by a congressionally mandated limit of 55 advisors. 55 U.S. advisors are the most military advisors could be in the country, period. Many people called it the double nickel. During my period of time, it was more predominant that we referred to it as the 55-man speed limit, where there could only be 55 U.S. military advisors assisting the El Salvadoran armed forces, with the idea being that was going to prevent the buildup to a war like Vietnam. I'll talk more about that, but it is really important to understand the antecedents that led to that and what happened in our country as a result of the Vietnam War and the early post-war experience. So, Bud, you've read a lot about this and understand a lot about it as a historian. And some listeners, if you're much, younger than me, you may not know anything about it. But the post-Vietnam period was a period in this country of, we were demoralized. The pullout of Vietnam in 1973 was certainly one of the most embarrassing moments in U.S. history. And after we'd fought a more than 10-year war in Southeast Asia to essentially lose it and to have lost so much blood and treasure and to just abandon the country because we never tried to win the war, it was very demoralizing. Nationally, our response to that was to retract from world affairs. A couple of things happened legislatively by Congress to try and prevent what they saw as the antecedents to another Vietnam occurring. One was the War Powers Resolution. I think that was 1973. And the other was the Arms Control Export Act, which I think was 1976. the reductive logic that Congress used, and it was very specious reasoning that led to those two legislative acts to hamper the executive branch's ability to commit armed forces overseas, was all based in, like I say, very reductive logic. Vietnam started out as a military advisory mission where we provided military advisors to the South Vietnamese army to help them fight the communist insurgency from the north. And that as military advisors in Vietnam engaged in combat, that led to more and more commitment of U.S. combat forces, of U.S. military goods and foreign military sales, until the executive branch, without ever declaring war in Vietnam, had us embroiled in a full-scale war that lasted 10 years and resulted in almost 70,000 Americans losing their lives and the loss of our blood and treasure, and nothing was ever accomplished. Of which, of course, there's a lot within that, but the reductive logic used by Congress post-Vietnam with the War Powers Resolution and the Arms Export Control Act was to limit the executive branches to do that same sort of thing, to say that the U.S. could not commit combat troops anywhere in the world for any period greater than 60 days without congressional approval. That, it hampered foreign military sales of arms to other nations without congressional approval. And by the same token, limited technical support and advisory support of U.S. forces going to those countries, all in an attempt to hamper presidential power that Congress felt is what led to the Vietnam War. So if you're tracking with me now, that's what was going on in the post-war years. Now, the other thing that happened is there was a great series of military failures during the 1970s, failures of foreign policy and flat-out military failures that further demoralized our national will to be a world power and to do what our national command authority is supposed to do, which is, pursue our national interests. So, there were things that were heavy in the public mind during that period of time. Under the Ford administration, immediately afterwards, we talked about the Korean tree cutting incident, where, we had a unit of U.S. forces who traveled into the DMZ to essentially cut down a tree that the North Koreans were using to defeat our ability to detect and observe what was going on the DMZ. And the North Koreans sent a platoon of soldiers who murdered our soldiers. In fact, they axed them, in a horrific way. And our response to that was very, very weak. We essentially did nothing. Not long, the Mayaguez incident. Are you familiar with that? Sure. For people who don't know, it was kind of the cap of the Vietnam War that also happened during Ford's administration, where a merchant vessel, the SS Mayaguez, was captured off Cambodia by the Khmer Rouge. Mm-hmm. And we had people taken hostage, and ransom was demanded, and a military operation was launched to free the hostages. It was an ad hoc military mission put together by the Marines and the Navy. And at the end of the day, we had several helicopters shot down, many Marines killed. From a lack of intelligence, we didn't even know that the hostages had more or less already been released, put out to sea, and weren't even on the island when the military force raided. And however I've glossed over some of the historical facts of all of that, the public perception was, the Korean tree cutting incident, the Mayaguez, ended the Ford presidency with our military and our national command authority wasn't capable of intervening in world affairs. The Carter presidency came along and the nation retracted further. We gave away the Panama Canal. The Carter-Torrijos treaties were finalized, which I hate to tell you, my family's personal hero, John Wayne, lobbied Carter on behalf of Torrijos to give away the Panama Canal. I have, there's more about that later. Very quickly, Russia invaded Afghanistan and we did nothing. We boycotted the Olympics. And then suddenly the Iranian Revolution happened. The embassy was taken, and we had American hostages held by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard for 444 days. And these are the things that dominated, the American politics and the news and the national sentiment when I was growing up, and was in high school in the 70s. What we had seen is, love him or hate him, Kissinger, Henry Kissinger, do you know who he was?
Oh, yeah.
Henry Kissinger was Secretary of State, National Security Advisor during the Nixon and Ford years. And, just stating what the history was so that you understand. And like I say, I'm trying to put El Salvador into perspective and why what Special Forces did there was so significant to the history of the regiment and to, our national understanding. Kissinger had a foreign policy outlook, that was called realpolitik, which is, we're going to deal with the world the way it is. Countries aren't going to look like Jeffersonian democracies or have human rights records like the United States, but that doesn't mean that we're not going to deal with them as they are in order to further our national interests worldwide. When the Carter administration came into the power, it came into power as there are a lot of parallels. Like I say, we look to history to understand the present and the future because there's nowhere else to look. If you look at the differences in policies between, say, the Trump administration and the Biden administration, where a successive administration seems to do something 180 degrees opposed to what the previous administration did, that's exactly what happened when Carter came into power. National foreign policy became based on that we were only going to deal with countries that had perfect human rights records. And we abandoned allies all over the world, and U.S. influence and projection of power decreased greatly. Like I say, that's why we abandoned the Shah. And I'm just reporting the facts, not trying to put a ethical or moral cap or say, here's how we should have done things. But that's what happened. And that was, like I say, the national atmosphere, the zeitgeist that we lived under leading up to 1979, when the Somoza family fell out of power in Nicaragua, and Nicaragua fell to a Marxist revolution supported by Cuba, by the Eastern Bloc, Soviet Union, Vietnam, 100% worldwide Marxist supported terrorist, network, 100%. And that at the very end of the Carter administration, Central America, right on the border of the United States, essentially our own backyard, was getting ready to fall to the communist bloc. There's no question about it. That was what was happening. Now, to give you an understanding of that period of time, most of those Central American countries were not Jeffersonian democracies. They were not places with, very good human rights records. And, anywhere where there is social injustice and those disparities of wealth, particularly in agrarian societies, those are places that are the breeding grounds for Marxist thought and Marxist revolutions. And that is exactly what was happening in those countries. It's not that they did not have great disparities of wealth and social injustice. They certainly did. But our way of dealing with those countries that accelerated so much of that during the Carter years was that we abandoned those countries. We said, you have human rights abuses, you have a terrible record of that, we're going to shut off the foreign aid pipeline, we're going to shut off any military aid, and you're on your own until you make all of these reforms. And that is factually the breeding ground that led to places like Nicaragua falling and the rest of Central America getting ready to fall. So in 1979, leading into 1980, even the Carter administration had to face facts that the civil war in El Salvador was ramping up. It was in the news every day. El Salvador is a very small agrarian country, a poor country, very densely populated, that had been ruled by a series of military committees, what they called juntas, which were a combination of, the 5 families of El Salvador, the 5 major landowning families, and military powers that had basically ruled the country since the 1930s. And then there'd been periods of civil unrest and revolution, particularly in the 1930s, which were put down very brutally by the people in power. And the same sort of thing was happening again in the 1970s, with Cuba and Nicaragua able to give the revolutionaries in El Salvador so much tangible support. El Salvador was well on its way to falling. So the Carter administration in its waning days, started to trickle through military aid to El Salvador, but of course, and rightfully so, very closely tied to the observance of human rights. And what happened is, just at the brink of, literally December 1980, January 1981, where the Carter administration is getting ready to hand off to the Reagan administration, who, much like our last president, got swept into office by a very large popular vote of America saying we want a better route forward. And Reagan had campaigned very heavily on fighting the intrusion of communism and the Eastern Bloc into our hemisphere. Carter's, one of his last acts out the door was to hamper those efforts. And Zbigniew Brzezinski, the Secretary of State, I believe at the time, and the whole State Department and Congress worked together to limit the number of advisors who could be assigned to El Salvador to assist. And the 55-man speed limit, the double nickel, historically, it's been researched, was a very arbitrary number. It's a small country. What's the minimum number of people you think you could get away with trying to do something that might be effective, but at the same time, wouldn't put us in combat roles and drag us into a bigger war? And without any real reasoning behind it, 55 was the national speed limit, and the same kind of specious logic and reductive reasoning that was used to establish the national speed limit in the 70s, with the idea it was going to, save our dependence on foreign oil. That same kind of, like I say, of like piss poor logic was used to determine how many military advisors could be assigned to El Salvador. And by the time Reagan took office and that was agreed to in congressional testimony, that was as good as signed in ink, that the maximum number of military advisors in El Salvador was going to be limited to 55 people, no matter what happened, without seeking congressional approval, which with Congress being ruled by the left and the progressives was never going to happen, because the national, like I say, the zeitgeist of the country, the national atmosphere, based on all of those things, like I had talked about up to that point, was that we had lost our ability to project national power and to do things successfully. And, certainly, not pointing fingers, not blaming anybody, but what happened just before that in the failure of the Iran hostage rescue was another national thing that was in everybody's minds, that just through no fault of those guys, it all weighed on the side of, we don't have the capability or the will to do great things outside of this country to further our national interests. And these are all of the elements that, were antecedent to suddenly, really with Reagan coming into office, saying, all right, we are going to fight communism in this hemisphere. And the civil war in El Salvador is a test case for our national foreign policy and our ability for diplomacy and military intervention to turn back communism, to keep another Central American country from falling. But, we're going to have to do it with 55 people. God. So, there is no, people should realize this, and it's very interesting about special forces. There is no doctrine that defines what a special operations campaign is. But that special forces has at its root unconventional warfare as its mission, and that really everything else special forces does is kind of a subset or an offshoot of the unconventional warfare mission, as furtherance of our national policy. And given whatever conditions are on the ground in a country, politically, geopolitically, militarily, this is when special forces becomes, the frontline foot soldiers of our foreign policy. It's like I say, there's no doctrine that says these are the conditions where this is a special forces war or a special operations campaign. It is that these are the conditions that exist. Who are the best people to carry out the mission in furtherance of our national objectives? And in situations like was occurring in El Salvador, it's clearly special forces exists as the unit that's capable of doing those things. So, given the national stricture set upon the executive branch by Congress of how we were nationally going to fight the intrusion of communism into this hemisphere, 3rd Battalion Special Forces Group is thrown into the middle of trying to help win a civil war and keep another country from falling to communism. And you're going to do it with both hands tied behind your back. So, in the Special Forces unconventional warfare mission, which I've said, every other Special Forces mission is a outgrowth of understanding that basic mission. The idea is it was formulated from the birth of Special Forces by Aaron Bank and the OSS from the 1950s, is that, a 12-man A-team was set up that it is going to work behind the lines in a foreign country with a popular uprising, freedom fighter movement, to help train, advise, assist, lead by, with, and through a popular uprising to overthrow a government or a despotic regime in furtherance of our national policy, right? Using irregular warfare rather than the overt commitment of U.S. conventional troops to see that outcome. And back in the 50s, the idea is that's probably what Special Forces was going to do across the Eastern Bloc, behind the Iron Curtain. Behind the Iron Curtain is, help popular liberations, or what we would call an insurgency against like their communist overlords, and help to turn back the tide of communism in Eastern Europe. But of course, what happened is the Civil War in Vietnam kicked off and we found ourselves fighting communism in Southeast Asia. But at the core of the UW mission is the idea like a 12-man A-team is going to advise, assist, train, lead, like essentially a battalion-size guerrilla unit of irregulars, of indigenous irregulars, which is variably described as being like anywhere from 500 to 800 man battalion size unit. You get where I'm going? A 12-man A-team doing that mission behind the lines with about 500, indigenous troops that they've trained and they're now taking in to do, their dirty deeds across inside a country. So in El Salvador, what you had is a very small country. I mean, you could drive across El Salvador if such a thing were possible. You could drive across it in a car east to west, and I bet about 3.5 hours. It's a very small, densely populated country divided into 6 military zones or brigades where the Special Forces effort to advise and assist the El Salvadoran Armed Forces in fighting the communist insurgency was done with sometimes 3, sometimes as few as 1 Special Forces operator in a brigade, in a military zone that might, comprise hundreds of thousands of civilians, with a military unit numbering in the thousands. Some of them brigade combat team size elements where, like I say, where you might have units of 5,000 or 6,000 people being advised, trained, and by 1, 2, or 3 Special Forces operators. So those of us who participated in those missions, like I say, one of the strengths of Special Forces is within the A-team, the 12-man concept of specialists working together, able to provide for our own security, doing what we do, being able to, go on, train people, take them on missions, help them improve, help to drive the aggressiveness of the military end of the campaign, work on a civic action level to provide for human rights and, improved treatment of civilians and all those things we're supposed to be able to do, is all of a sudden reduced to where you've got, I had missions, like myself, where, one of my large 6-month missions there was a national level mission where me and a partner were responsible for the medical training for all of the El Salvadoran armed forces and all of the civil defense forces for the entire country. With 2 of us, teammates of mine who would be assigned to say work with the Guardia Nacional, which is like a civil police, or the national police, where one guy is essentially working with a unit of 10,000 people, on a national level program, working everywhere in the country. The civil defense program. A friend of mine, one of my previous team leaders, who was a captain, who was in charge of the irregular civil defense program, a national level program working in the entire country, with those programs all by themselves. And then the guys who were in with the numbered El Salvadoran infantry brigades, the 6 brigades and the 6 military zones in the country, where at times I want to say 84, 85, there might be a Special Forces major or a colonel, a Special Forces E7 or an E8, who's the operations and intelligence sergeant, and maybe another Special Forces officer or an NCO, where you had 3 guys working in a single military zone, basically run by a brigade all by themselves. And by the time 86, 87, 88, the 3 years that I was working in that country, you might have one or two SF operators at most in those same positions. Where you are in a military quartel, brigade compound, that is dependent on its own defense against attack from the Salvadoran guerrillas, with zero external support, no U.S. air support whatsoever, no QRF force that's coming to your rescue, where as history well demonstrates, that mass assaults by the Salvadoran guerrillas that overran brigade compounds, that resulted in special forces operators having to engage in combat, was common. And this all occurred under a atmosphere where our actions and our participation was meant to be completely silent and off the radar. Historically, years later, it's been proven through documents that the Memorandum of Understanding in the Reagan National Security Council was that military operations in El Salvador by special forces would be denied, that if there were combat actions, combat casualties, or combat deaths, that it was implicit that they would be attributed to other factors and not admitted to. And that's part of the historical record. Guys like Greg Walker, Special Forces operator who preceded me in 3-7, who participated in some of the earliest missions in El Salvador, who continued his Special Forces career. And Greg Walker, more than anybody else, in his guise as an investigative journalist and a historian, has done an absolutely stellar job of recording all of this for posterity, not only for the benefit of the Special Forces Regiment, but for the benefit of the history of security assistance and foreign relations that should be studied. And hats off to Greg Walker. What he has done for us all, for the nation, has been invaluable in his excellent documentation of all of the things that occurred geopolitically and militarily during this period of time. So that's why we were in El Salvador. That is the atmosphere that we found ourselves in. Those are the strictures that we had to operate on. And, at the end of it, by the drawdown of the guerrilla troops in 1992, and the cessation of the actual civil war, El Salvador stands as an example of a successful counterinsurgency that was run largely by a handful of U.S. Special Forces operators over those years, and like I say, was successful. The problem with it is, on one hand, starting in the GWAT and beyond, it was frequently referred to and used as an example of how successful a small footprint operation could be to solve a national problem like the civil war in El Salvador, which was absolutely true. But again, it's kind of specious logic that it was held up as like a blueprint for how to do those things, and it ended up being successful despite itself, because of the dedication and the quality of the United States Foreign Service officers and diplomats, by the other government agencies, and by U.S. Special Forces that operated in those countries. with the strictures that were placed on us, it is the excellence of the few individuals who helped to fight that civil war that brought about its success, rather than it being an example or a blueprint for how to do a small footprint operation without committing large amounts of U.S. forces and exposing us to that kind of international criticism at home on the left. Do you get what I'm saying with that?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, I know I've been going on for a while about all of those things, but it's very important to understand that it was a complete success. But by the same token, the strictures that were placed on how we assisted them, the El Salvadorans, win that civil war, while it did minimize the risk to the United States, it unnecessarily prolonged the human suffering to the Salvadorans that they experienced during that civil war. You know, I am not alone in saying, you know, all of those missions would have been best carried out by Special Forces A teams at a minimum. It would have best been accomplished by more Special Forces operators in the country that would have better provided for oversight and adherence to human rights by the Salvadoran military and the Salvadoran government. And it would have done so earlier and better, and we would have been quicker at performing aggressive, effective military operations against the guerrillas and ending that war in a period of a handful of years, if not just a few years, instead of it going on for, 12 years or more. So like I say, that's a lot of, like I say, background and the geopolitics of what was going on, without delving into a lot of the specifics and the operations and things like that. But, this is you reaching out. This is a very fortuitous time and memorial, is Monday past, the 31st of March, marks the 38th anniversary of when my friend, Special Forces operator Staff Sergeant Greg Fronius, was killed in 1987 in the attack on El Paraiso in the 4th Brigade of the El Salvadoran Army, which resulted in Greg, like I say, being alone by himself with the 4th Brigade in Chalatenango province and El Paraiso, El Salvador. Greg being by himself when the camp came under a huge assault by the Salvadoran guerrillas and was eventually repelled, but ended up in Greg's death while he was doing the best he could by himself to lead and assist the 4th Brigade in repelling the guerrilla attack, in which he succumbed and was by himself that day. That's a great picture. I gave you a lot of pictures of the 4th Brigade of El Paraiso where Greg got killed. That's a very special gentleman there. That is, this was about 6 months maybe after Greg got killed. I was in country at the time, and I'll talk about that later on another mission with the immediate reaction battalions when Greg got killed. But this is in the 4th Brigade, Chalatenango. That's then Major John McMullen, who was the senior SF operator advising the 4th Brigade in Chalatenango province. A stellar Special Forces officer, a real mentor to me and somebody I looked up to greatly. A great guy, and who he and Greg Walker, I only came to learn this just a few years ago, that it was due to his and Greg Walker's efforts that combat service in El Salvador was eventually recognized by the Department of Defense, that it was admitted to and not disavowed, and people got the credit that they deserved. But there's some other pictures. The 4th Brigade Chalatenango, is a military brigade that's built in a bowl. It's surrounded on high ground by all sides. It's not a strategically defensible position. Yeah, there's a picture of me, looking like that. It gives you some idea of the uniform and equipment at the time. Virtually, you would say uniform and equipment wise, SF, that we were pretty much indistinguishable from the Vietnam era as far as our gear and equipment.
Let me call you back in just a minute. I'm on a phone call. Yes, sir.
But yeah, no problem. But that's 4th Brigade. That's El Pariso behind me. Like I say, I'm within the brigade compound, and you can say it's got high ground on all sides. It had actually been overrun a couple of times previously. So it's a really difficult place to mount a defense from. The night Greg got killed, and it's like I say, you have to, imagine the situation as it was and why it is. It should be recognized and appreciated. In contradistinction to like what most SF teams and most SF guys are probably used to throughout the GWAT. Many friends of mine and people who had been on both ends of it, like I say, said El Salvador was Vietnam with zero support. That's what it was. There's, like I say, there's no quick reaction force that's going to come for you if your brigade or the military detachment that you're advising, if they get overrun and attacked by the guerrillas, it's you and you're on your own. That's what it is. There's no close air support. Salvadoran Air Force didn't have the ability to perform night operations. And I'm not disparaging them in any way, but to say that, even during daylight operations, if I would trust the Salvadoran Air Force to come and perform like close air support for me during the daylight hours, I had commando sections who, the Salvadoran, their own Air Force, would blue on blue them, where it's like, don't bomb us, we're the good guys, my naval infantry commandos, out, the Marines, where they were riding in the sand, BIM, BIM, the Marine infantry, the response to that would be an A-37 coming by and dropping a 200-pound bomb on their message, trying to tell them, we're the good guys. So no, there's no support coming for you. And everybody in the country is basically on their own. So at the time the time of Greg's attack, I was working with one of the immediate reaction battalions, Biri Bracamonte. I was there with a small team. Actually, there were 4 of us. A bit later, I'll talk about the human rights abuses by the guerrillas. And that's specifically why I was working with the immediate reaction battalions during that period of time. But communication in country, our only radio net was FM handheld Motorola radios. That the FM radios worked throughout the country by a series of repeater towers, on the volcanoes and on the mountains throughout the country that let us all communicate with each other. So it's a vastly different world. That's a different story.
Okay.
that's a satellite communication dish at an OGA site down on the south coast of El Salvador and the Gulf of Fonseca, which we should come back to that because that's a really funny story. But our communication was by handheld radio. That's just what it was. SATCOM per se, only existed at the embassy. There wasn't anybody to call for help anyway. Nobody was coming. but it was certainly a heck of a thing that night to be with an immediate reaction battalion and be listening on the radio as the mill group and the operations center in the Capitol was talking to us, and hearing for a brief time Greg's voice talking about the attack that was going on in El Pariso, and then not hearing anything more from him. And of course, like I know every other SF guy in the country who was on the net listening, I mean, there might only been, 12 or 18 of us in the entire country, all itching to, get on a helicopter, walk, do anything that we could to get there and bring relief to the 4th Brigade, knowing that Greg was there by himself.
Jeez Louise.
The night passed, and of course, the OPAT, the Special Forces officer there, who was partnered with Greg, wasn't, and I may get this part of the story wrong, but he wasn't in the compound that night. He was on another mission. I don't remember if he was in the Capitol or elsewhere, but he wasn't physically there during the attack. And he was in, of course, with a lot of the mill group and operations people the next day as soon as they could, because really the Salvadoran Air Force and even our own air crew that was supporting us with UH-1 helicopters really only had the ability to successfully do daylight operations for the most part. And they were on the ground. My friend and teammate Steve Thornton was in the Capitol and was on the first helicopter into El Pariso to try and find Greg, and is the one who made pickup on Greg's body. And now, even 40 years later, 38 years later, I hate to talk in too much detail about it because it's very gruesome. But there was very little of Greg's remains. Initially, I talked to Steve Thornton, who made pickup and brought Greg's remains home that day, or brought him back to the Capitol so they could be repatriated to Panama. It initially appeared like maybe Greg had maybe been hit by a mortar round, and you can imagine what that would have done to his poor body. Later on, I think it was determined that the guerrillas desecrated his body with explosives, either hand grenades or improvised demolitions, for the purposes of propaganda to kill a U.S. advisor. So there was very little of Greg left. But there's no question that Greg had been out trying to, organize an effective response and help repel the attack when he got killed. And certainly, he was a great Special Forces operator. I mean, he was a human being. He had feet of clay. You pricked him, he bled. He was a very human guy, but he was well loved and well respected. And everywhere he went, he did a fantastic job and was a wonderful representative of Special Forces, especially 3-7, and he was greatly missed. Things that are important and that all came out in subsequent years related to all of that. It was discovered much later that a full-scale mock-up of the 4th Brigade compound had been constructed in Cuba.
Jesus.
And part of the worldwide communist terror support network, and part of that little part of the map that you showed us of the Gulf of Fonseca and that relationship between El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, in the 79, 80, 81, the guerrillas conducted very successful large-scale combat operations against the El Salvadoran armed forces. In fact, the El Salvadoran armed forces in those early years were damn near arming the guerrillas with U.S.-made M16s because entire units were leaving the battlefield, dropping weapons, and very factual that those things happened. By the time the full-scale mobile training teams from 3-7 got into the country, by the time the operational planning assistance training teams of SF advisors got assigned to the brigades and training and advising and working on actual combat operations, the El Salvadoran armed forces really picked up in the aggressiveness and capability to fight the guerrillas. And by the mid 80s, the guerrilla campaigns were fewer and far between. They didn't have a toehold in the capital in San Salvador anymore. Their attempts to disrupt the election of the Salvadoran National Assembly in 1982, their ability to disrupt the national presidential election in 1984, that had been, there were some very difficult times in many of the military zones throughout El Salvador. And I'll take this digression, it's one of those things, the special forces operators on the ground working as, protectors of human rights, who were supervising and helping to plan the civil defense and safe conduct of those elections. That's the kind of thing special forces operators find themselves thrown into, doing those kind of civic actions and civil law enforcement missions. And they did it beautifully. And the elections came off, and it proved to the world that the diplomats and the foreign service officers and unbeknownst to the world, special forces were doing their job to help democratize El Salvador and help to remove the reasons why the communist insurgency existed in the first place. And now I've done one of my took an offshoot and forget where I was going with things. Kind of leading back to Greg's death, Greg Fronius's death on 31 March 1987, and the overall kind of situation. The attack on El Paraiso, when the guerrillas were trying to carry out large brigade style attacks, it took them about a year or more of planning and training to try and pull something like that off. That part of the country I showed you, part of the human interdiction, of us trying to interdict arms and supplies and material support coming into El Salvador, and the exfiltration of guerrillas out of El Salvador to be trained in Nicaragua. Well, not in Honduras. We had that locked up, but Nicaragua, Cuba, Vietnam, the Soviet Union. I mean, we had guerrillas picked up who had attended Patrice Lumumba University in Moscow. We had, there were, I wanted to talk a little bit about the guerrillas' mine warfare campaign in the country. There was no, we called them booby traps back then, but, IEDs. There was no IED that existed in El Salvador that was used by the guerrillas, and they carried out an unrestricted IED campaign in the entire country that resulted primarily in innocent civilian deaths and injuries. Every device that had ever been used in the war in Vietnam was used in El Salvador because that's who trained them. So it's like I say, it was a worldwide support by the communist bloc for the insurgency in El Salvador. But to carry out the brigade attack on the 4th Brigade in El Salvador, the guerrillas had exfiltrated their troops out of the country to be trained, and a great number of them were trained in Cuba. And years later, photo reconnaissance proved that they had built a full-scale mock-up of the El Pariso compound in Cuba. And, and talking to captured guerrillas and getting to understand how they did things, they would take individual guys, small numbers of guys who they're very unsophisticated, and then would train them how to do one task. Like this 3 main element, you are going to attack this reinforced bunker on the perimeter of the compound. That is your job. They taught those guys how to infiltrate, just like, the Viet Cong. They used, bamboo splinters to pierce the throats and the voice boxes, the tracheas of the troops manning those positions on the perimeter to silently approach. They would train small units like that, and it took them a long time to train people how to do all of those different things, how to train mortar teams, how to train assaulters, how to do things like that, and basic infantry tactics, and then infiltrate them all back into the country with the material support, and then organize them. And during those years, like 86, 87, 88, the guerrillas were able to pull off like one pretty major offensive against a brigade size element about once a year. And that's what Greg was up against. He was up against a worldwide sponsored and funded communist terror attack on El Pariso, with him there all by himself. Damn. That's what he was up against. Another element that it's very important historically that only came out to light at the beginning of the GWAT working against him was the traitorous actions of a defense intelligence agency operative named Ana Montes.
Yes.
She was a operative of Cuba who was an employee of the Defense Intelligence Agency as an analyst, who was investigated, captured, and charged in September of 2001, just a couple weeks after September 11. Ana Montes had been recruited as a Cuban agent during her time as a college student, and she subsequently ended up in DIA as an analyst and worked as an agent of Cuba. That's her. All throughout Central and South America. And it is known factually that she was at El Pariso at the 4th Brigade compound 3 weeks before the attack on El Pariso.
Holy crap.
And talking to one of the gentlemen who took part in that investigation, because I was had a lot of DIA friends, and talked to one of the guys who took part of that investigation, who convinced me that the evidence was absolutely there, that she learned the location of the advisor house in the compound and shared that with the attacking guerrilla force, so that the guerrillas knew where the U.S. advisors, the U.S. Special Forces advisors were on the 4th Brigade compound, and that likely is what led to Greg facing such an overwhelming number of assaulters, coming directly for him. So I am absolutely convinced that is factual. I am absolutely convinced that Ana Montes's actions as an agent for Cuba led to or was solely responsible for Greg's death. She should have been given the death penalty for her traitorous actions. I think she served a 20-odd year sentence, and I believe that she was released from federal prison within the last couple of years, which she never should have. She was an unrepentant believer in the justness of her cause. She was a romanticist for Castro and Cuban Revolution, and did everything that she could as their agent to undermine U.S. foreign policy in Latin America.
Jeez, yeah, I watched a 60-minute special on her. They were recovering that case, and I had no idea about that. But now thinking how much DIA info she had, it's a wonder if we'll ever find out more instances like that she ruined. That God, what?
Well,
I
can tell you, evil. I can tell you the time that it was obvious. You know, I haven't talked a lot about the foreign service officers and the State Department people and the other government agencies who worked in El Salvador, who I have to tell you that neck and neck, my admiration for my fellow Green Berets who served in El Salvador, the foreign service officers and the diplomats and the other government agency people who worked out of the embassy in El Salvador were people who I came to have the highest level of respect and admiration for. America really stepped up and sent the best and the brightest to help solve the problem of the Civil War in El Salvador. And it's like I say, it was a human endeavor. You know, there were, people had feet of clay, and if you pricked them, they bled. And there were people, myself included, who made mistakes and, wish there were things they could have done better. But my subsequent experience working with country teams, with mill groups, and working out of many embassies, working with the State Department and working with a lot of those people can be very difficult. I have a very good friend who had a long career in Army Special Operations, who ended up working with another government intelligence agency out of a U.S. embassy for the last few years of his career. And he was a little nervous going into it. He's like, geez, I'm a trigger puller. I really don't know too much. I've never really worked in that world. That's what USF guys do. And I said, well, as long as you understand this, when you're dealing with State Department people, they see in color, you see in black and white. You're a knuckle-dragging troglodyte, and they have a master's degree from Georgetown. They look on you as a barely sapient person who is there to do their bidding, and there is nothing that you can tell them that they don't already know. And it's like I said, and what I told him was, I said, if you ever want to know why our foreign policy is screwed up everywhere, go work with the State Department somewhere overseas, and you'll understand why our foreign policy is the way it is. That being said, the people who were part of the country team, the military political section, the foreign service officers, the diplomats, the other government agencies working during the period of time where I were in El Salvador, the case officers, everybody, I had the highest admiration and respect for them because they were workers. They were smart people. They were only too happy to be part of a team effort. I think all of us were people who appreciated competence in the people we were working with, who worked together well. And while our effort in El Salvador overall, I think, suffered and was delayed, number one, because there's so few special operators out there actually doing the ground mission out where it needed to be carried out. There wasn't a lot of national level coordination between government agencies and the military who are doing things like that. But nonetheless, the personal relationship and that atmosphere of mutual respect, and I would call it patriotism, that the desire, all wanted to do the right thing, and we wanted to make our country proud of the job that we did, that nonetheless, very great things were accomplished by a small number of people. And yeah, there are very notable exceptions. One of those notable exceptions that it might be kind of popular to talk about these days are like the things I witnessed with the U.S. Agency for International Development.
Oh God, yeah, the USAID. Yeah.
USAID has a very long history of fuckery around the world, where in addition to doing good things, have also kind of always seen themselves as a rogue agency. There is a very, very predominant, if you've worked in Washington for any period of time, or like I say, worked in overseas missions, there's this, we didn't call it the deep state back then, but it's very appropriate, where civil servants who believe themselves to come from the elite of academia, of intelligentsia, believe that they're smarter than the elected representatives, who set the rules for the country. That, seeing people who they enact policies on the spot to further their own ideals or their own beliefs, in contradistinction to what the National Command Authority has asked for, was very blatant. One example I recall at the time, which is, when USAID, who was doing a lot of good things, funding civic action programs throughout the country. I mentioned like the IED campaign that the guerrillas carried out throughout El Salvador, of which the primary victims were, the peasantry, to Marxists, idealized statists, who the end goal is a Marxist revolution. The people are inconsequential. They're not individuals. That's their duty, is proletariats, to die for the greater good of the cause. And, the guerrillas' primary way of deterring military dismounted operations to root out and pursue the guerrillas was by an IED campaign. And, that's where, I came in, one significant mission, working with one of the immediate reaction battalions who was sustaining horrific losses due to IEDs. But in addition to that, it was the locals, the peasantry, the farmers, the campesinos, men, women, and children, going out to try and, dig a living out of the earth for subsistence, who were stepping on those mines. And AID rightly funded a very large program that became self-sustaining to train orthopedic surgeons and prosthetists to be able to provide prosthetic limbs for civilians and soldiers who'd been injured by the unrestricted mine warfare campaign of the guerrillas. But that went on for years and years. But then there were things. One of my partners was running the civilian defense program, which a program very similar to what's used in every insurgency, is having local military advisors do like an SF thing where they're leading, training, assisting irregular civilian defense groups, basically militias, to provide security for their own communities. And I had a hand in part of those programs in every one of the military zones where I was privileged to work. But AID, I can remember it very clearly. It was 1987 where AID in country issued a policy where any community that had a civilian defense group that we were sponsoring and training, AID was not going to commit any U.S. resources to civic action in those communities, they were so clearly set on conditions to sponsor and support the communist guerrillas and not U.S. efforts to remove the communist guerrilla threat from those communities. So if we were building, if we had civilian defense groups that we were arming and training in some village in El Salvador, AID was not going to use monies to go and dig wells and build schoolhouses in those communities. They made it as a de facto, a rogue agency policy, which is pretty unconscionable. Somewhere in there, I think I gave you an example. Somewhere after you called me and talked about doing this, I dug through an old box and found some of my diplomatic identities and my cover identities that I used in El Salvador. And you don't have to bring them up, but I'll use it as an example. One of the cover identities that I used over there was as a technician working for the Agency for International Development. Oh yeah, there it is. Pretty funny. Which is Salvadoran, foreign relations, their foreign embassy ministry. Identifying me as a North American technician working for the Agency for International Development as a cover identity, because working in the capital city or in other areas, and being in civilian clothes and things like that, having to move all throughout the country, having some kind of plausible or at least usable cover identity was certainly useful. When we were working in the military brigades or in the detachments, the military detachments, and actually working, I won't say, I'll put it like this, working with the military, we were in uniform. Other times doing things with like the civilian defense groups, with the national police, the security police, and working around the capital or in other urban sites, we were in civilian clothes doing those missions. Part of the worldwide communist presence that was notable there was also highlighted by the presence of the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross. The ICRC, which was primarily a Swiss group, had representatives all over the country observing human rights. And it was really common almost anywhere to be. You could be out in the hinterlands, out in the middle of nowhere, and here's this group of, clearly, Caucasian European guys running around with the guerrillas. So, like I said, I'm not sure where I am in the story, but just trying to paint a picture. And, that ID, I only ever used that ID once. And I used it in this way. On this one particular mission, it was a national level mission. I was based out of the capital and living in like State Department provided housing, which was really quite luxurious. It was like a little villa, with pretty good perimeter security. And we had private contract security, Wackenhut, contracted security guards to provide security. So it was a place when you were there and you were in the capital, you could relax a little bit and, and at least worry, not have to like patrol your own grounds, hoping you were going to be safe, things like that. But working in and out of the embassy, working with other military units and police units around the capital, very early on one of those missions is, there's only so many streets. There's only so many ways to go from like the embassy or the Guardia Nacional or the National Police headquarters. There's only so many ways to travel between there and like your home base. there's only so many counter detection routes you can run. And me and my partner were very regularly being followed by, a group of Western Caucasian Europeans, the same 2 or 3 guys in the same vehicle who were, putting a tail on us and following us from the embassy, following us to other sites. We would drive around the city and try and lose them until they would, eventually lose interest. And, many times in the morning, leaving our villa, in San Salvador, those guys would coincidentally be, driving by and follow us. And it's like, and I reported it, of course, to our embassy regional security officer. The embassy RSO is the guys who's responsible for security, and the particular RSO there, a guy named Bill Lee, we became to be very good friends, was just a fantastic guy. And working with him and the DIA and the case officers around there to let them know what was going on, it was basically like, yeah, that's going on. Yep, it's probably, ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, is not, neutral. Yes, they are likely part of groups that are, putting surveillance on you and trying to there ain't too much we can do about it. We can use our local, the RSO security forces to try and keep an eye on it. But as far as like counter intel and stuff, there's not too much to do about it. So, expecting, at all times in the city, the biggest problem was worrying about vehicular ambushes. Because you couldn't run around the city with like an M4, my personal protection plan and how we ran, the M9 Beretta is the best pistol that we could conceal. But with a backpack, carrying an M9 on my person, carrying a small backpack with 2 magazines, with a couple of CIA mini grenades, with a smoke grenade, was about the best we could do to maintain relatively low visibility in an urban environment, but to still give me the ability for some kind of personal defense, and that ability to, like I say, with a vehicular ambush to try and break contact. To just, I know it's more interesting to talk about like tactics and techniques and procedures and the threat environment and things like that. So anyway, one day, we happened to be in a safe zone at one of the restaurants where it was okay to go to. And these 3, guys who were clearly with the International Committee of the Red Cross in the same vehicle that I'd picked up tailing us on multiple occasions were there. And I just kind of had my fill of it. And I went over there and put on my friendliest, oh gosh kind of face and talked to these guys in Spanish. And their Spanish was not that great, but being European, being Swiss, they spoke, a Euro mumble kind of English pretty good. I said like, hey guys, how you doing? I've seen you guys around a lot, and I've always just kind of wanted to introduce myself. Hey, I work for AID, and laid my ID on them, and said, yeah, I'm a civil engineering student from University of Michigan, and I took a summer job with AID here, going out into the country and building wells and schoolhouses and working with the campesinos, against the righteous imperial impression of the United States and stuff like that. Oh, the floodgates opened up. Oh man, these dudes were visibly really, yes, kind of like pre-Austin Powers, so right on, baby, fighting the imperialist pigs, but in Euro mumble and stuff like that, and shot the shit with them for a little bit, and gave them that idea, and got the and quickly talking about the whole thing and sitting down and having a cup of coffee with them is there was no question that if a guy like me or any of us had been captured by the guerrillas, the ICRC would have been there shaving bamboo splinters for the guerrillas to hammer under our fingernails, as the is the bringers of, American Western oppression, and stuff like that. They were flat out commies. But I never saw, but those guys never tailed me again. I'm sure that the location of our, of where we were housing at, that was well known, that they shared it with the guerrillas, whether my, half-ass tradecraft effort to convince them that I was with AID and I was one of the good guys, from their perspective, bore fruit or anyway, I'll never know. But more than anything, I was just, threatening those guys wasn't going to work out. That was going to cause an international incident, but it was a way of maybe throwing them off the scent, and maybe it bought us some breathing space. But, I'll tell you, firsthand experience, working in any of the brigade compounds, if we had a patrol out on operations and they came in contact with the guerrilla force, and especially if they captured prisoners and were bringing them back to the quartel, you knew it, because members of the ICRC would be parked at the front gates of the brigade waiting for the patrol to come back with prisoners. Sometimes that's how we knew a patrol was successful and had prisoners and intelligence, because the guerrillas were and the ICRC were in bed together, and the ICRC, like I say, would be waiting at the brigade compound for a patrol to come back with guerrillas. 100%. I guess it's probably worth saying something that's very interesting about the civil aspect of how the Salvadoran government and their legislative system treated guerrillas who were picked up on the battlefield. The legal constraints that the Salvadorans operated under was that we would call them battlefield detainees now, but the Salvadoran military could hold a battlefield detainee for 72 hours before they had to be released to the civilian authorities. And most often they were released to a group that contained the International Committee of the Red Cross, and were then taken to the capital and turned over to the civilian authorities, the civilian legal authorities, for processing. I've heard over the years, accusations that the Salvadoran military, tortured detainees, or they did things like that. And I can say unequivocally, not that I was everywhere at all times and saw everything, but working with the Salvadorans and knowing so many of them so well, there's a big difference between a guerrilla commander who was trained in Cuba and the Soviet Union and some poor campesino guerrilla who is more or less press ganged into a guerrilla cell and forced to fight against the government. There's a big difference between those two, and they were certainly treated that way. The overall attitude of the Salvadoran military officers and NCOs who I worked with very closely was that the guerrillas were Salvadoran citizens. They were fellow citizens caught up in a very inequitable situation, and that they were treated as the guerrillas were treated when they were captured, treated as best as was humanly possible, with respect and dignity. And they were treated not as like military enemies, but treated as people on the different side of a political spectrum. And I never saw, even the most ardently, radicalized, ideologically motivated guerrilla, I did not see abused. And I certainly never saw anything that was like torture. More than anything, the interrogators, tried to persuade by humane treatment the guerrillas and get any operational actionable intelligence that they could out of them through, rational persuasion and good treatment before they were released to the legal authorities to be processed through the judicial system. And overwhelmingly, what happened to most of those detainees, even people who we knew were very hardcore guerrillas, is the judicial system released them for lack of evidence. I mean, you would not only hear these things where an operation resulted in guerrilla prisoners who were, tactically questioned, released to the civilian authorities, processed by the legal system, that we would hear about it later, but you would read about it in the newspaper the next day that they were released by a Salvadoran judge for lack of evidence, and and essentially returned to their communities and returned to the battlefield. So, like I say, for years that I was there very consistently, 86, 87, and 88, I can say that was most commonly what I observed.
That's been an outstanding talk on El Salvador and the political layout, and as well as what y'all are facing militarily. I mean, this is anytime we've had a seventh group guy on from Vietnam to talk to us, it pales in comparison to what you've explained to us. We've hit the 2 hour and 15-minute mark here.
You poor guy.
No,
I'm so sorry to everybody.
No, this is right up our alley. This is the stuff we love to hear. I was gonna see, since we've kind of hit a good stopping point with El Salvador, would you like to pick up part 2 and talk a little bit about sniper school and then some of the stuff you were doing in Colombia and Peru and such for part 2?
It would be my honor to get to in part 2. I promise we will dive more into like the I was there stories, and this is how I saw, and this is how we did. This was very much like a history and a geopolitical conversation, if you will. Next time, there's lots of great stories about operations in El Salvador, and some pretty funny stuff that I know has never come to light about things that we did there that should be part of the historical record. And then, a lot about the counter narco-terrorism missions. And my small role as a sniper during those years. I like I say, I promise from the bottom of my heart to make it more, there I was kind of stories, and try and make that more fun and approachable.
No, this was laying the groundwork for part 2 to give us the whole encompassing view of what you're going to be facing in part 2. So no need to apologize whatsoever. This is our crowd right here. This is exactly the kind of stuff we like to hear. So maybe I'll check with your schedule. I mean, I've got nothing planned for the rest of the month as of yet. Some stuff in the air, but maybe next week or the week after, if you're not busy.
I'll be down at Benning next week for International Sniper Comp, and be down there coaching my teams down there. And then, but we'll link up and we'll figure out something maybe a week after, while thinking about this, while some of this is still fresh in this old brain.
That will be perfect. And I can't thank you enough for spending time with us this morning. And I can't let you leave without giving you a good luck wish, and hope your boys do good down there at the tournament.
That's very kind. Thank you so much.
Yes, sir. And everybody's already saying, heck, if we can't get it all in part 3, bring him back for a part 3. So you understood the assignment well. So we appreciate it.
Thank you. Like I say, if I don't know it all, I wasn't there for everything, but I was a participant and a witness to a lot of history. And before I go out, if through your wonderful efforts, if there's something that I can share about all of this that will help everybody, but especially the current special forces operator, understand, what their big brothers were up to. Not to drag this out, but I tell SF guys a lot. It's like, our community doesn't talk a lot about itself. We are the quiet professionals. Things like, the activities in SOG and Dead A were only known through oral tradition within our own teams. SOG, it was 20 years past the fact, 30 years even, when many of those operations came to light. Special Forces Dead A was unknown until only a handful of years ago. Things like this that occurred in El Salvador, which is going on 40 years. If people think I'm betraying confidences or mad at me for speaking about, them from our community, I certainly understand that. But, 30, 40 years down the road, some of this has to be told while there's still some of us around who can. And again, what I tell the SF guys, and I say to all of them, is like, you want to know the kind of things that it's the possibility that you may be doing in the future. Learn the history of what SF has been doing in Vietnam, in Central and South America, the special projects, the kind of things that we did with OGA, because you have to go back that far to understand the kind of things that you may someday be a part of when the conditions are right. Everybody gets a mission. Everybody talks about foreign internal defense, and it's like, oh man, I had this crappy mission. We went and worked for these, third world booger eaters, and I can't say we did anything valuable, and we're just in a crappy place and doing crappy things. And it's like, everybody gets a mission like that. But if you are doing the right thing you're supposed to do as an A team, everybody's doing things in the right way, understanding that this is preparing you for when you get the really good mission that only an A team is going to do. And those kind of missions are the kind of things that you can look to historically to understand what may be expected of you in the future as an SF operator. And if you understand that, you'll never look at any mission as being beneath you or mundane.
That's perfectly said. Absolutely perfectly said. And I know people that have been asking me to get into the deeper dives in history are going to love this. So we may have a slew of questions come part two once this gets up and gets around. So I will get it ready and shut down for the day. And again, thank you, Mr. John, and good luck next week. And
Thanks,
just stay in touch with me, and we'll be set up and ready whenever you get time.
All right, my brother, I look forward to it.
Yes, sir. God bless.
Thanks, man.